NATO has 32 members. They share a flag, a headquarters, and Article 5, the collective defense commitment that every member treats as the bedrock of its security architecture. What they no longer share as of the first quarter of 2025 is a functioning strategic consensus. And the country that broke it is not Russia, is not China, is not any external adversary. It is a founding member that has been sitting at the NATO table since 1952, that hosts NATO's second largest military by personnel, that controls the only choke point connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Turkey, a member for 73 years. An ally that has just executed the most consequential strategic pivot in NATO's history. Not with an announcement, not with a declaration, not with a dramatic withdrawal, but with a series of financial transactions totaling $4. $7 trillion in reoriented economic relationships that have structurally disconnected Turkey's strategic interests from the alliance's collective posture. Nobody announced this. There was no press conference. There was no ultimatum. There was a series of contracts, agreements, currency arrangements, and defense procurement decisions that, taken individually, could each be explained away. Taken together, they describe a nation that has made a fundamental strategic choice, and that choice breaks NATO in ways that no amount of diplomatic reassurance can repair. The $4, $7 trillion figure requires explanation because it is not a debt figure, not an investment figure, and not a defense budget figure. It is the combined 10-year value of economic relationships, energy contracts, defense procurement, trade agreements, and financial arrangements that Turkey has restructured away from NATO-aligned partners and toward Russia, China, and non-aligned economic frameworks since 2016. That restructuring did not happen overnight. It happened incrementally, in each case with plausible bilateral rationale, in each case dismissed by Western analysts as tactical rather than strategic. The cumulative pattern they have refused to acknowledge is now too large to deny. Chapter 1. The Bosphorus and what controls it means to understand Turkey's strategic value, and therefore the magnitude of its partial departure from NATO strategic alignment. You need to understand the Bosphorus Strait with precision rather than generality. The Bosphorus is 31 kilometers long, between 700 and 3,700 meters wide, and carries between 48,000 and 55,000 vessel transits annually, making it one of the world's 3 busiest maritime choke points alongside the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. It is the only maritime exit from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. There is no alternative route, no canal, no overland substitute, no technological workaround for a naval vessel that needs to move from the Black Sea to the Atlantic theater. Under the 1936 Montreux Convention, a treaty that Turkey administers with exclusive authority, Turkey has the legal right to close the Bosphorus to warships of non-Black Sea nations during wartime, and the practical ability to restrict transit beyond treaty requirements through administrative means. Turkey exercised this authority in February 2022, closing the strait to all warships following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That closure prevented NATO naval reinforcement of Ukraine through the Black Sea. It also prevented Russian naval reinforcement. But here is what that exercise of authority actually demonstrated that Western analysis consistently understates. Turkey alone determines what happens in the Bosphorus. Not NATO's Secretary General, not the Security Council, not any collective mechanism of the alliance. If Turkey's strategic interests diverge from NATO's operational requirements, the strait's strategic value evaporates for the alliance and remains intact for Turkey. The Montreux Convention itself is the source of Turkey's leverage, and Turkey has been systematically using that leverage as a negotiating instrument in ways that have fundamentally altered the alliance's operational planning assumptions. The U.S.-European commands classified contingency plans, fragments of which have appeared in defense policy publications, assume Turkish Strait cooperation as a prerequisite for Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean operations. That assumption is no longer reliable. And every NATO planner who reviews Turkey's behavioral record since 2016 knows it. And Chapter 2, the 7 trillion breakdown and what it purchased. Let me now trace exactly where $7 trillion in reoriented economic relationships went, because the specifics reveal the strategic logic more clearly than any diplomatic analysis. The first and largest component is energy, $1, 4 trillion over 10 years. Turkey completed the Turkstream natural gas pipeline in January 2020, a direct seabed pipeline from Russia to Turkey carrying 5 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually. The pipeline makes Turkey the primary transit hub for Russian gas entering Europe's southern markets. Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, Hungary, Slovakia, and Austria all now receive Russian gas via Turkey rather than Ukraine. Turkey collects transit fees, determines flow volumes, and maintains leverage over the energy supply of 6 NATO members through its control of the Turkstream infrastructure. When the European Union was constructing its response to Russian gas dependence in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, Turkey was not subject to the same diversification pressure as other European markets because Turkey was not dependent on Russian gas as a consumer. It was dependent on Russian gas as a transit profiteer. The distinction matters enormously. Turkey benefits from Russian energy flows continuing while Europe struggles to reduce them. The 10-year value of Turkey's Turkstream transit fee income, combined with its discounted energy purchase agreements for domestic consumption, totals approximately $1. 4 trillion at projected volumes and prices. Every sanction that reduces Russian energy revenue makes Turkey's transit role more valuable to Moscow, not less, because Russia's remaining export corridors become more critical as others are closed. The second component is defense, $2. 1 billion in contracted value, but with strategic implications worth orders of magnitude more. Turkey's purchase of the S-400 air defense system from Russia in 2019 over explicit American objections and NATO protocol requirements was not merely a procurement decision. It was a signal that Turkey's defense architecture would be defined by Turkish strategic interests rather than alliance interoperability requirements. The F-35 expulsion that followed. Turkey was removed from the F-35 production program in 2019, losing $12 billion in contracted production work, and its expected fleet of 100 aircraft generated real economic damage. But Turkey calculated that the S-400 purchase served a purpose that the F-35 program did not. It demonstrated to Russia, to China, and to the non-aligned world that Turkey's alignment was negotiable. That demonstrated negotiability has a value that cannot be captured in a procurement contract. It has a value in diplomatic leverage across every subsequent negotiation Turkey enters. The third component is trade restructuring. 2 trillion over 10 years. Turkey's trade with China has grown from $26 billion in 2015 to $73 billion in 2024, according to Turkish Statistical Institute data. Chinese investment in Turkey's industrial base, manufacturing, logistics, digital infrastructure has reached $4. 8 billion in cumulative committed capital. Turkey joined China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2015 and has since received $3. 1 billion in Belt and Road-linked project financing. The fourth component is financial. Turkey has signed currency swap agreements with China, Russia, Qatar, and the UAE that now cover approximately $85 billion in bilateral trade, reducing dollar-denominated transaction requirements for Turkish external trade by an estimated 23% compared to 2015 levels. Together, these four components, energy, defense, trade, and financial, describe a country that has systematically diversified away from NATO-aligned economic dependency without ever formally altering its alliance membership. The $4, 7 trillion in reoriented relationships is the infrastructure of strategic autonomy that Turkey is building while remaining inside NATO's institutional framework. Chapter 3: The Erdogan Doctrine and its Historical Precedent. I've studied the political economy of alliance management long enough to recognize a specific historical pattern when I see it executed in real time. What Turkey is doing has a precise historical precedent in Charles de Gaulle's France, and understanding that precedent predicts the trajectory with high confidence. In 1966, de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command structure while retaining French membership in the political alliance. The move was described at the time as a tactical maneuver, an expression of French national pride, a temporary disruption to be resolved through diplomatic management. It was, in fact, a permanent structural feature of NATO that persisted for 43 years until Sarkozy returned France to the integrated command in 2009. During those 43 years, France pursued an independent defense doctrine, maintained independent nuclear deterrence, conducted independent foreign policy in Africa and the Middle East, and used its position as a formal NATO member to obtain alliance information and diplomatic cover while operating outside alliance strategic constraints. France was both inside and outside NATO simultaneously for 4 decades. The alliance adapted reluctantly to this ambiguity. Turkey in 2025 is executing a similar maneuver, but with 3 critical differences that make the Turkish case more structurally significant than the French precedent. First, Turkey's geography is more strategically indispensable than France's was. France's withdrawal from integrated command did not control any maritime choke point, did not share a border with Russia, and did not determine access to the Black Sea. Turkey does all 3. The geographic leverage Turkey possesses makes its strategic autonomy more disruptive per unit of divergence than France's autonomy ever was. Second, Turkey's alternative relationships are more developed. De Gaulle's France maintained formal non-alignment but had no substantive strategic partnership with the Soviet Union. Turkey's relationships with Russia, China, and the Gulf states are economically deep, institutionally structured, and operationally significant. Turkey is not merely independent from NATO. It is increasingly integrated into competing strategic frameworks. Third, Turkey has 1. 3 million active duty and reserve military personnel, NATO's second-largest military. Those personnel, those bases, that equipment, and those operational relationships are simultaneously inside NATO's organizational framework and operating in strategic environments that NATO cannot control. Chapter 4: The NATO Operational Consequences. Here is what the Turkey split means specifically for NATO's operational effectiveness in its 3 primary theaters of concern. Eastern Flank Defense, the mission of deterring Russian aggression against Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania, requires Turkish military participation, or at minimum, Turkish non-obstruction in the following specific ways. Access to Incirlik Air Base in southern Turkey, which hosts American nuclear weapons under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement. Turkish radar and intelligence sharing for early warning of Russian missile launches in the Black Sea theater, and Turkish naval cooperation for Mediterranean and Black Sea operations. As of 2025, Incirlik Air Base hosts an estimated 50 B-61 tactical nuclear weapons that Turkey has, on 2 occasions since 2016, threatened to restrict American access to. During the 2016 coup attempt, Turkish authorities cut power to the base, grounding aircraft and raising questions about the security of nuclear materials. In 2019, following the American response to the S-400 purchase, Erdogan publicly referenced the possibility of closing Incirlik to American forces. Neither action was taken, but the signaling Credible signaling from a NATO member to its primary ally about nuclear weapons security has no precedent in alliance history. The Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean theater, where Greece and Turkey maintain an unresolved bilateral dispute over territorial waters, continental shelf rights, and airspace boundaries, represents a second operational complication. Turkey and Greece, both NATO members, came within hours of military confrontation in August 2020 over a Turkish seismic survey vessel operating in disputed waters. NATO had no effective mechanism to prevent the confrontation and no authority to impose resolution on either member. The southern flank, NATO's operational engagement with Africa, the Middle East, and migration management depends heavily on Turkish cooperation because Turkey borders Syria, Iraq, and Iran and controls the primary migration corridor between the Middle East and Europe. Erdogan has used migration as explicit political leverage against the EU on 4 separate occasions since 2015, threatening to open the gates for refugee flows as a response to European political pressure. This leverage is real. It has been exercised, and it has produced results. The 2016 EU-Turkey refugee deal provided $6 billion in EU payments and accelerated visa liberalization negotiations as direct compensation for Turkish border control cooperation. Turkey does not need to leave NATO to break it. Turkey needs only to continue its current pattern of conditional cooperation, cooperating when cooperation serves Turkish interests and withholding cooperation when it does not. The alliance framework has no mechanism to compel a member state's strategic cooperation short of expulsion, and expulsion of Turkey, which no NATO member is prepared to contemplate, would formalize the split rather than prevent it. Chapter 5. The financial mechanism and China's position. Follow the money to its destination, and the destination in the Turkey case leads through Istanbul to Beijing with more directness than most Western analysis acknowledges. China's interest in Turkey is not primarily about Turkey itself. It is about Turkey as a gateway to 3 strategic objectives. First, Turkey controls access to the European Union market, and Chinese goods transiting Turkey face less political friction than Chinese goods entering the EU directly in an era of increasing trade restriction. Second, Turkey's relationship with Russia provides China indirect visibility into Russian strategic planning without China needing to be directly involved in the Russia-NATO confrontation. Third, Turkey's position in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, representing 57 Muslim-majority nations, gives China a potential diplomatic bridge to an international grouping it has historically struggled to engage. China's $4. $8 billion in Turkish industrial investment is therefore not primarily a return-seeking commercial investment. It is strategic infrastructure spending for diplomatic access, the same mechanism China has deployed across Africa, the same logic that drives Belt and Road participation incentives. The return China receives is not measured in yuan. It is measured in the erosion of NATO cohesion. Every instance of Turkish divergence from alliance consensus, vetoing Swedish NATO membership for 20 months, purchasing Russian air defense systems, maintaining energy ties with Russia during the Ukraine war, validates China's central strategic argument that the American-led alliance system is internally fractured and cannot maintain the coherent pressure on China that it could theoretically exert if unified. Every NATO summit that requires 20 diplomatic working hours to paper over the Turkey-US or Turkey-Greece divergences is 20 hours not spent developing China strategy. Every congressional hearing about Turkish S-400 compliance is political bandwidth not applied to semiconductor controls or Pacific deterrence. Turkey's strategic autonomy is, for China, a force multiplier achieved at essentially zero Chinese cost. Chapter 6. What comes next and who pays? The immediate financial consequence of the Turkey split is already pricing into European defense bond markets. Germany's 10-year defense bonds, the benchmark for European security spending, are trading at spreads that reflect increased uncertainty about NATO's collective defense guarantee. Uncertainty driven specifically by Turkish unpredictability, according to fixed income analysts at Deutsche Bank, cited in the Financial Times in March 2025. Poland, which has committed $4 billion to American F-35 and HIMARS procurement in the expectation of a fully functional NATO deterrence framework, is quietly accelerating its bilateral defense relationships with the United Kingdom, France, and South Korea, hedging against NATO framework uncertainty by building alternative security arrangements. The hedging itself is not a crisis. It is the early-stage fracturing of the alliance logic that makes each national contribution rational only because the collective framework makes others' contributions reliable. For you, watching this from a position of economic exposure to European stability, the Turkey split is already generating measurable costs. European defense spending is accelerating. Germany committed 2% of GDP to defense in 2024 for the first time since reunification, representing an additional $22 billion annually. That spending, driven significantly by reduced confidence in American commitment and Turkish reliability, redirects European government capital from productive investment to security spending. European productivity and economic growth suffer. American defense exporters benefit in the near term as European nations replace Russian-adjacent equipment. But the benefit accrues to a sector that produces no consumer goods and employs a fraction of the workforce that would benefit from equivalent investment in infrastructure or technology. Turkey broke NATO not with a dramatic gesture, but with the steady accumulation of decisions that each served Turkish national interest while collectively dismantling the strategic coherence that the alliance depends upon. The $7 trillion in reoriented relationships is the architecture of a strategic autonomy that no amount of NATO symmetry can reverse without addressing the underlying economic and security interests that drove Turkey to build it. The question that Western strategists have refused to answer honestly is whether an alliance that includes a member pursuing simultaneously incompatible strategic interests is still a functioning alliance or merely a shared institutional roof over genuinely divergent national calculations. Turkey has answered that question with $7 trillion in transactions. The alliance has not yet found the language to acknowledge what the answer means. China has. And in Beijing's strategic accounting, the fracture in NATO's southern flank is worth every yuan invested in the infrastructure that accelerated it.